You have no idea what you're doing. You're 66 years old, for God's sake, and you're about to hand my son a company I spent my whole life building.
I already did that 4 months ago. You just weren't paying attention.
I've already spoken with an attorney about your competency, about whether someone your age is actually fit to keep making decisions like this alone.
Garrett's voice cracked across the room, loud enough for every one of the 40 guests, still holding their champagne, to go quiet. He said, "You have no idea what you're doing. You're 66 years old, for God's sake, and you're about to hand my son a company I spent my whole life building." "I already did that," I told him, 4 months ago. You just weren't paying attention. The room went completely still. My own son looked at me like he had never once in 45 years actually seen my face. "Say that again," he said. "You heard me the first time, Garrett. My name is Noreen Doyle. I am 66 years old, and until that night, standing in my own dining room on my own birthday, I don't think my son had ever really looked at me at all. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments. And please, stay with me until the end, because I need you to understand one thing before I show you how we got to that room. 6 months earlier, I was just a grandmother getting ready for a wedding, the same as I had 100 times before. I had no idea I was about to find out exactly what my own family thought I was worth. The morning of Delaney's wedding, I woke up before my alarm, the way I always do now, and lay there a minute listening to the gulls outside my window before I let myself get up. Cresswell Harbor sounds different in June than it does the rest of the year, warmer, busier, boats already moving out past the breakwater by 6. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the water the way Vernon and I used to, not talking, just looking, because after 40 years of marriage, you learn that some mornings don't need any words in them at all. I took my time getting dressed. Not because I'm vain, though I'll admit 66 doesn't mean a woman stops caring how she looks, but because it was the first big family event since Vernon passed that felt like it deserved some ceremony of its own. I chose the deep green dress he always said made me look like I belonged on the cover of a magazine about the ocean, whatever that was supposed to mean. I pinned on the small silver brooch shaped like a scallop shell that he'd bought me the year we opened our second location, back when neither of us could believe 2 restaurants was even possible. "You look like the woman I married," I told my reflection, the way I sometimes still do, and for just a second I could almost hear him say it back to me in that low, amused voice of his. I drove myself to the ceremony, the way I have to almost everything now, and for a moment sitting in the driveway with the engine still running, I let myself feel how strange it was to be going to a family wedding alone. Vernon would have driven, the way he always did, humming along to whatever was on the radio, reaching over without looking to squeeze my hand at every red light between our house and wherever we were going. I sat there a minute longer than I needed to, then wiped my eyes carefully so as not to ruin anything, and backed out of the driveway. The ceremony was held at Cresswell Point, an old estate on the water that Doyle's Chowder House had catered 100 times over the years, though never once for our own family before. Delaney looked radiant coming down the aisle on her father's arm, and for those few minutes, watching my granddaughter marry a boy who so clearly adored her, everything in me felt settled and whole. When the officiant asked if anyone wished to say a word for the couple before the vows began, I found myself thinking not of anything I might say, but of Vernon's hand in mine at our own wedding 43 years earlier, on a dock not unlike this one. Garrett stood tall beside her, proud in a way I hadn't seen from him in a long time. Even Colette, elegant in pale gold, dabbed at her eyes twice that I noticed. It was at the reception that everything changed. Doyle's Chowder House had handled the catering, which meant half the staff working the room that afternoon, where people I had trained myself decades ago, back when I still ran the kitchen on weekends and knew every regular's order by heart. A young server named Bethany, who had worked the front counter at our original location since she was 19, caught my eye across the lawn and gave me a small, genuine wave, the kind that made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't prepared for. It should have felt like the proudest afternoon of my life, watching my own restaurant feed my own granddaughter's wedding. For a few minutes it did. The venue had set up a long table near the entrance with place cards laid out in neat rows, each one lettered by hand, meant to guide every guest to their seat. A young woman working the table smiled and sorted through the D's until she found mine. "Here you are, Mrs. Doyle," she said, handing me a heavy cream-colored card. I glanced down, expecting to see my name and a table number, the way it should have been. Instead, in the same careful calligraphy as every other card on that table, it read, "Noreen Doyle, the family's unlimited account." My hand went still in the air. I read it twice, certain I had misunderstood something. "Is everything all right?" the young woman asked, noticing my face. I forced a smile and told her there must have been some mix-up with my card. She leaned over, saw it for herself, and her eyes went wide. She apologized and said she'd check if there was a replacement somewhere, and I told her not to worry, that I would sort it out with my family myself. I didn't want to make a scene at my own granddaughter's wedding, so I pinned the little card to the ribbon meant for it and walked into the reception with my cheeks burning. I learned much later that Colette had emailed the calligrapher the wording herself the week before, while Delaney was at her final dress fitting and nobody else was reviewing the list. Just a joke between family, is what she called it afterward. Nobody thought to read through the whole batch of cards before they went out. Nobody except, as it turned out, Delaney herself, who told me months later that she'd spotted it early, before the guests arrived, and hadn't said a word, because Silas's mother had pulled her away to take photographs at exactly that moment, and by the time she remembered, the moment had already passed her by. I tried to enjoy the cocktail hour. Most guests either didn't notice the card pinned to my dress or were too polite to say anything about it. An older man I recognized as one of Vernon's old fishing buddies stopped me near the raw bar and took both my hands in his. "Best chowder on this whole coast, and everybody here knows exactly whose recipe it still is," he said, nodding toward the buffet table. "Vernon used to brag about you something terrible, you know that." I thanked him, feeling something in my chest loosen just slightly, grateful for a stranger's plain kindness, in a room where my own families had gone missing. Then I overheard two women near the bar, women I didn't recognize. One of them saying, "Did you see the grandmother's little name card?" And the other one laughing and saying something like, "Guess we know who's really footing the bill tonight." I moved away before they saw me listening, my hands not quite steady. Garrett found me a few minutes later and waved me over to a small group near the water. "Mom," he called out, "come meet the Hartleys. Dad used to charter with Bill back in the day." I walked over, and Garrett, laughing, said to the couple, "This is my mother, Noreen, the reason this whole wedding happened, our very own line of credit." The woman's smile faltered. Her husband looked uncomfortable and said something kind about how fondly he remembered Vernon. I shook his hand and said only Noreen Doyle, Vernon's wife, and excused myself as soon as I politely could. I found Garrett alone by the bar a little later and asked him directly what that card was supposed to mean. "Come on, Mom. Don't be so sensitive," he said, laughing it off like I'd missed an inside joke. "Everybody in this family knows you're the one with the deep pockets since Dad left you comfortable. God, it's just a joke. Lighten up, it's a party." Before I could answer, Colette appeared beside us in her gold dress, slipping her arm through mine like nothing at all was wrong. "There you are," she said. "We wanted everyone to know exactly who made a day like this possible." She and Garrett laughed together, and I excused myself to find somewhere quiet, just to have a minute alone. I splashed a little water on my wrists in the powder room and stood there breathing for a minute, telling myself it was just a party, just a silly card, nothing worth ruining Delaney's day over. When I stepped back out into the hallway, I nearly walked straight into Alden Cole, who had been Vernon's lawyer and closest friend for as long as I could remember, a tall man in his 70s who still wore a suit like it was decades earlier and still called me Miss Noreen out of some old habit neither of us had ever bothered to correct. He must have seen something on my face because his own expression changed at once. He asked if I was all right, and I told him, honestly, that I wasn't sure. I gestured toward the little card still pinned to my dress. He read it, and his jaw tightened in a way I had rarely seen from a man as composed as Alden. "That is not funny," he said quietly, and Vernon would not have found it funny either. I told him it was fine, that I would deal with it later, that I didn't want to make more of it than it already was. He hesitated, glanced back toward the reception, then lowered his voice and asked if I had a moment, somewhere quieter than a hallway. We stepped outside onto a small stone terrace, overlooking the water, away from the noise of the party. "There's something I think you should understand," he said, "now that we're standing out here anyway." Vernon set some things up before he passed, quietly through me, that he asked me not to mention unless it ever became necessary. I don't know if tonight counts. But I think you should hear it from me before you hear a version of it from somebody else. He explained carefully, the way lawyers do when they want you to actually absorb what they're telling you, that years earlier, Vernon had restructured the ownership of Doyle's Chowder House through a family trust, and that I had been named the sole trustee with full and lasting authority over how control of the company would ever be passed down to the next generation. Garrett ran the company day to day, Alden said, and had every right to. But he did not have the power to sell it, restructure it, or hand it off to anyone else without my agreement, because legally I was the one holding the final vote. I stood there a moment, just staring out at the water. Why wouldn't he tell me this himself? I finally asked. Alden said Vernon never wanted it to change how our family treated me, that he wanted them to be good to me because they loved me, not because they were afraid of what I controlled. He hoped it would never need to matter, Alden told me. I think tonight might be telling us both that it does. I folded that thought up small and put it away, the way you do with something too big to look at directly in the middle of a party. Not tonight, I told him. Tonight belongs to Delaney. But soon I want to understand everything, all of it. Alden nodded and said he'd have the full documents ready whenever I was ready for them. Then I fixed my hair, unpinned that ridiculous card from my dress, and slipped it into my purse instead of throwing it away, and went back inside to dance with my granddaughter, like nothing in the world had just quietly shifted underneath me. The morning after the wedding, I sat at my kitchen table, still in my robe, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, and I took that little card back out of my purse and set it down and just looked at it for a long time. The family's unlimited account. I thought about how long I had let that be true without ever once saying it out loud to myself. I got up and went to the hall closet, the one where I still kept old filing box because I never bring myself to throw out anything with Vernon's handwriting on it. And I pulled out 3 years of bank statements and canceled checks and sat down on the floor like a much younger woman, sorting everything into piles. It started small, the way these things always do. 6 months after Vernon's funeral, Garrett and Colette had invited me to dinner, which even then felt like an occasion. Somewhere around dessert, Colette mentioned, very casually, that they were thinking about redoing their kitchen. Nothing major, just new counters and appliances. And wasn't it something how expensive everything had gotten? I remembered writing that first check for $22,000 without really thinking twice about it. Because what was the point of money sitting in an account if it couldn't make my own son's life a little easier? That 22,000 became new cars for both grandchildren when they turned 18. It became the down payment on the house Garrett and Colette live in now. It became family vacations I was invited to and quietly expected to fund. Sitting there on my kitchen floor, adding it all up in a little notebook, I got to a number just over $280,000, and I had to set my pen down for a minute. I thought about the night I'd almost said no to that first check, 3 years ago, sitting across from Garrett at that dinner table with my fork halfway to my mouth, feeling something in my stomach that I didn't have a name for yet. I remember telling myself it was grief making me suspicious of my own son, that surely I was imagining something that wasn't there. I wrote the check anyway. I told myself the same thing, more or less, every single time after that, right up until the moment I read a place card at my granddaughter's wedding and finally ran out of room to keep telling myself anything at all. The phone rang while I was still staring at that figure. It was Colette. "Noreen, are you home? I've been calling your cell," she said, and I told her I was fine, just tired after yesterday. She said she was calling to thank me for everything, that the wedding had been perfect, that Delaney and Silas were so grateful for my generosity. I thought about the $48,000 I had written for the venue and the catering alone, and said only that I was happy to help. Actually, she went on, her voice shifting into that warm, practiced tone I had come to recognize over the years. That's part of why I'm calling. Silas's parents were supposed to cover the honeymoon, but his father's business has had a rough year, so that's fallen through, and Delaney is just devastated. They've had their heart set on 2 weeks in Italy, a proper food tour through Tuscany. Garrett and I would obviously contribute, of course, on top of everything we already put into the wedding, everything they had put into the wedding. I sat there with my own handwriting staring back at me from a dozen canceled checks and told her only that I would think about it. There was a pause on the line, the kind that told me she hadn't expected that answer. They do need to book soon for the good rates, she said. I told her I would call her back tomorrow, and when I hung up, I went back to my little notebook and sat there a while longer, looking at the and at Vernon's handwriting on some of the older pages, and wondering how exactly we had gotten here. A knock at the door pulled me out of it sometime in the early afternoon. Griffin is my younger grandchild, Delaney's brother, and out of the whole family, he has always been the one who reminds me most of his grandfather. Through the little window, I saw him standing on the porch, shifting his weight the way he does when he's nervous, still in the same rumpled button-down shirt he'd worn to the wedding the day before. I gathered the papers off the floor and slid them back into the closet before I let him in. "Grandma, are you okay?" he asked, pulling me into a hug the second the door was open. "I've been texting you since this morning." I told him I was fine, just a little tired, and led him into the kitchen to put the kettle on. "I wanted to say something about yesterday," he said, sitting down at the table. "The card, the way people were talking. It wasn't right, and I should have said something when I saw it." I asked him if he'd noticed it too, and he said of course he had, so had half the room. He looked down at his hands, embarrassed. "I should have said something," he said again. I told him it wasn't his job to correct his parents, but that it was mine to stand up for myself. And he looked at me directly then, in a way that reminded me so much of Vernon it nearly took my breath away. When Griffin was 7 or 8, Vernon used to stand him on a milk crate at the prep counter on Saturday mornings before the restaurant opened, teaching him how to properly clean a chowder pot, how to taste as he went, how to never rush the roux. Garrett had tried the kitchen exactly once as a boy and declared it too hot and too boring within the hour. I don't think Vernon ever said a word about the difference between his son and his grandson, not once in all the years after. But I know he noticed it the same way I was noticing it now, sitting across the table from a young man who had somehow kept hold of the thing the rest of us had slowly let go of. "Mom and Dad have gotten different since Grandpa died," he said. "Or maybe I just didn't want to see it before now. All they talk about anymore is money. Your money, specifically." I asked him what he meant, and he hesitated before telling me he'd overheard his parents a few weeks earlier, talking about the house, about how it might be time for me to think about somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to manage, and how it could free up some money for everybody if I did. My stomach went cold hearing it, though after the last 24 hours, I honestly couldn't say I was surprised. Before we finished our tea, Griffin told me something else, quieter this time, almost like a confession. A couple of years ago, he said he'd borrowed some money from me himself, a few $1,000s for a proper set of chef's knives when he first started working the line full-time, and he'd paid almost all of it back since. But he still felt strange about it, like it made him part of the very same pattern he was upset with his parents about. I told him that was different, that he'd asked me honestly and paid me back, and that there was nothing wrong with family helping family when it was done the right way. He looked relieved to hear it, though I could tell it had been sitting on him for a while. Before he left, he asked if I was really okay, and I told him, for the first time all day, the plain truth. "I think I'm finally starting to see things clearly," I said. He asked what that meant, and I told him I wasn't sure yet, only that something in me had shifted since yesterday, and I intended to find out exactly what. I stood at the window and watched him drive away, And for the first time since I'd read that little card at the check-in table, I didn't feel humiliated anymore. I felt something colder and steadier, settling into place instead. And somewhere underneath the hurt, for the first time in 3 years, I felt the beginning of my own name coming back to me. The celebration dinner happened 8 days after the wedding, on a Sunday evening, in the private dining room at the original Doyle's Chowder House on Harbor Street. The same building where Vernon and I had served our very first bowl of chowder over the counter 44 years earlier. Colette had organized the whole evening herself. A smaller gathering for the people who mattered most, she'd said on the phone, though I noticed the guest list ran closer to 30 than the intimate dozen she'd described. I almost didn't go. I sat at my kitchen table that afternoon, turning the invitation over in my hands, still raw from everything I'd found in those old files, still uncertain what I wanted to do with any of it. But Delaney had called me herself that morning, her voice bright and a little nervous, asking if I would please come, and I couldn't bring myself to disappoint her twice in 1 week. The old dining room looked the same as it always had, dark wood and brass fixtures, and a row of black and white photographs along the back wall, Vernon and me standing outside on opening day, impossibly young, an entire life still ahead of us that neither of us could have predicted. I stood in front of that photograph for a long moment, before anyone noticed I'd arrived. Dinner went pleasantly enough at first. Silas's parents, Tom and Rhonda Bramwell, sat near me, and Tom spent a good 10 minutes telling me how much he'd admired Vernon's business instincts back when they'd served on a town committee together years ago. I found myself relaxing, actually enjoying myself, until Colette rose from her seat near the head of the table and tapped her fork gently against her wine glass. "I just want to say a few words," she said, waiting for the room to quiet. "This past week has been everything we could have hoped for, and none of it would have been possible without one very generous person in this room." She turned and smiled directly at me. "Noreen, we all know how much you poured into making Delaney's day so perfect, and we wanted tonight to be a way of saying thank you." There was a warm smattering of applause, and I smiled and nodded, thinking that would be the end of it. It wasn't. In fact, Colette continued, her voice rising with a kind of bright, rehearsed excitement. "I have some wonderful news to share. Noreen has generously agreed to make sure Delena's Einzelis get the honeymoon of their dreams, 2 full weeks in Italy, starting in Rome and ending in Tuscany. Isn't that just the most wonderful gift?" The applause was louder this time. Delaney's face lit up with genuine, uncomplicated joy, and for a moment I hated more than anything that I was about to take that joy away from her in front of 30 people. I set down my fork carefully. "This is the first I'm hearing about any of that," I said, keeping my voice level, though I could feel every eye at the table swing toward me. The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone senses something has gone wrong, but nobody is sure exactly what. Colette's smile flickered just slightly. "We talked about this, Noreen," she said. "At the reception. You said you'd think about it." "I did say that," I told her, "and I have thought about it. But I never agreed to anything, and I'm not comfortable being told what I've committed to in front of a room full of people before anyone asked me directly." Garrett leaned toward me, his voice low, but not quiet enough. "Mom, please," he said, "not tonight." Tom Bramwell cleared his throat from beside me, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Honestly," he said, "Rhonda and I had always planned on covering the honeymoon ourselves. We only mentioned to Colette that things had gotten a little tight this year. We never meant for anyone to feel obligated." "I know," I said gently, looking at him rather than at my son, "and I appreciate you saying so. I'd be glad to help with a reasonable honeymoon, and I'll discuss exactly what that looks like with Delaney directly when it's just the two of us. But I won't be announced into paying for anything at a dinner table. And I don't think it's fair to Tom and Rhonda either to have their situation discussed this way in front of everyone." Colette's face had gone pale beneath her makeup. "Well," she said with a short, brittle laugh, "I suppose I misunderstood." Delaney looked back and forth between her mother and me, her earlier joy draining slowly out of her face, replaced by a look that was almost guilt, though I couldn't have said why in that moment. Grandma, she started to say quietly, but I shook my head gently at her, just enough to let her know this wasn't hers to smooth over. I stood up, folding my napkin carefully. Delaney, I love you, and Silas, welcome to this family, I said. I hope you both have every happiness. But I think I'm going to head home. I kissed Delaney's cheek, squeezed her hand, and walked toward the door. On my way out, I passed the little brass plaque by the entrance that Vernon had insisted on years ago. The one that simply read, established by Vernon and Noreen Doyle, with the date beneath it. I had walked past that plaque probably 10,000 times in 44 years, and never once really stopped to read it. That night I did, standing there in my good dress with my whole family behind me, at a table I had just walked away from, and something about seeing both our names carved into brass, while my son sat inside laughing. Off my objections cracked something open in me that had been holding steady for a very long time. I didn't cry until I was in the car. Then I sat in the parking lot without starting the engine, watching the lights of the dining room through the window, my family still sitting at that table without me. When I finally drove home, I didn't go to bed. I went straight to the hall closet again, and this time I didn't stop at 3 years of records. I pulled out everything, 15 years of it, boxes I hadn't opened since we'd first filed them away, and I started reading. Some of those boxes hadn't been touched since the year we'd moved into this house. I found receipts for kitchen equipment we'd retired a decade ago, tax documents in Vernon's careful block printing, a folder of old menus from before we'd settled on the chowder recipe that eventually made us who we were. For a while, I simply sat there surrounded by our whole shared history, spread out across the hallway floor, and it was almost peaceful, almost like visiting him, before I remembered why I was actually looking. It took most of the night. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, deep in a box marked with the year the Providence location had closed, I found a check I didn't remember writing, $31,000, made out directly to Garrett with a note in my own handwriting from years ago that simply said home repairs. I am not a woman who forgets writing a $31,000 check. I have never in my life been careless with money. Not when we were young and counting every dollar that came through the register, and not now, with more of it than I sometimes know what to do with. So I sat there on the floor with that single canceled check in my hand for a long time before I let myself keep looking, half hoping I would find some ordinary explanation folded into the pages around it. I found the corresponding entry in my own checkbook ledger from that year, in my own handwriting, and even there, the memo simply read home repairs, in a hand that looked slightly rushed, slightly unlike my usual careful script, as though I had written it quickly and moved on to something else without really thinking about it. Something about the date nagged at me until I got up, found an old accordion in the folder of company records Vernon used to keep at home, and matched it against something else entirely. 3 weeks before that check was written, the Providence location, our third store, the one Vernon had been proudest of, had closed without warning. I remembered it happening. I remembered being told it was a lease issue, a landlord dispute, nothing that could be helped. I sat on the floor of my hallway at nearly 3 in the morning with 2 pieces of paper in my hands that did not add up to the story I had been told. And for the first time since Vernon died, I understood that grief was not the only thing I had been quietly ignoring for the last 5 years. The following Tuesday, I called Faye Kestler, who had kept the company's books since before Delaney was born and had always been kind to me in the particular careful way longtime employees are kind to the boss's widow. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, if she still had access to the old Providence financials and whether she might pull together anything from around the time it closed. She said, of course, Mrs. Doyle, happy to help, and I thanked her and hung up feeling for a moment almost steady. I spent the rest of that week in a strange, suspended kind of waiting, going about ordinary things, watering the garden, returning a call from my dentist's office, all while some quieter part of my mind kept circling back to that check, that date, that word home repairs sitting slightly wrong on the page. I told myself I would wait for Faye's records before drawing any conclusions. I did not expect my own son to arrive at his own conclusions faster than Faye did. I did not think, until it was far too late to matter, that Faye had worked for my son for the last 3 years, reported to him every single week, and would naturally, innocently, without a single bad intention in her whole body, mention over coffee on Thursday that his mother had asked her to pull the old Providence files. Garrett showed up at my house on Friday evening, unannounced, letting himself in the side door the way he'd done since he was a teenager, calling my name before he'd even reached the kitchen. I was at the counter, halfway through a very ordinary bowl of soup for dinner, and I very nearly told him this wasn't a good time. I asked him if he wanted to sit, if he'd eaten, the ordinary reflexes of a mother that never quite turn off no matter how old your children get or how angry they walk through your door. He ignored the question entirely, standing there in the middle of my kitchen, still in his work clothes, tie loosened, looking like a man who had driven straight over without stopping to think about what he actually wanted to say. "We need to talk," he said, and something in his voice made me set my spoon down immediately. His face was flushed, his jaw tight in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the dinner just days earlier. "Faye tells me you're going through old Providence records," he said. "Care to explain why my mother is suddenly auditing a location that closed 5 years ago?" I told him, honestly, that I had found a check, $31,000, written to him, dated 3 weeks after Providence closed, labeled home repairs, and that I could not, for the life of me, remember writing it or understand what it had to do with the store closing 2 states away. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, a calculation forming about whether to explain or deflect. He chose at first to deflect. "That's ancient history, Mom," he said. "It has nothing to do with anything happening now. You embarrassed me and Colette in front of 30 people on Sunday, and now you're digging through 5-year-old paperwork like I'm some kind of criminal." "I didn't say that," I told him. "I asked a question. You're the one who showed up here upset about it." He ran a hand through his hair, and for just a second, underneath the anger, I saw something that looked almost like fear. "Do you have any idea what kind of year this has been?" he said, his voice cracking slightly on the word year. "Do you have any idea what's actually happening at the company right now? Or have you been too busy going through boxes in your hallway to notice that I've been trying to hold this whole thing together by myself since Dad died?" I told him I didn't, and that he should tell me right now exactly what he meant. He sat down heavily at my kitchen table, the same table Griffin had sat at just over a week earlier, and for a moment he looked less like the confident man who'd embarrassed me in front of strangers at his own daughter's wedding, and more like a tired, frightened man who had inherited something he wasn't sure he could carry. "The company is in trouble, Mom," he said finally. "Real trouble. 2 of the newer locations have been losing money for 2 years straight. Food costs are up. We can't find enough kitchen staff. And the loan we took out to open the Portsmouth location is coming due faster than we can pay it down. We're carrying almost $4 million in debt across the company right now, most of it tied to Portsmouth and the Nashua location, both of which I pushed hard to open, both of which Dad actually warned me against expanding too fast, if you want the honest version. I didn't listen. I thought I knew better, and now I'm the one who has to figure out how to fix it before the bank starts asking questions I don't have good answers to." I asked him what that had to do with the check. He looked away from me, out the window toward the water. "The Providence lease wasn't the only thing that went wrong that year," he said, some of his earlier heat already draining out of his voice. "I made some decisions with my own money around the same time, decisions that didn't work out, and I needed to cover a gap fast. And I asked you for help without explaining the whole picture, because I was ashamed, and because Dad was already sick by then, and I didn't want either of you to know I'd made a mistake that big." I sat very still, letting that settle. "And now," I said, "what is actually happening now, Garrett? Why are you really here tonight?" He was quiet again, longer this time, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its earlier heat. "There's a company called Harbor Line Hospitality Group," he said. "They've been talking to us for months about buying a majority stake, enough to take real control, enough to restructure the whole business, refinance the debt, bring in their own operational team. We signed a letter of intent 2 weeks ago. Nothing is final yet. But if it goes through the way they want it to go through, they've made it clear the original location, this one, Harbor Street, the one Dad built with his bare hands, doesn't fit their brand standards for a flagship. It would close within the first year. The kitchen went very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock on the stove, my own heartbeat somewhere in my ears. "You're talking about selling your father's restaurant," I said. "The one with our name on it. The one where we served our first bowl of chowder off a card table because we couldn't afford real furniture yet." "I'm talking about saving the company, Mom," he said, his voice rising again. "Saving the jobs of 200 people who work for us right now, saving something for Delaney and Griffin to actually inherit instead of a business that's bleeding out. And I can't do any of it without you. Because apparently, according to Alden Cole, I don't actually have the authority to approve a deal like this without your signature, which I only found out 4 days ago. Which is frankly, Mom, the first I'd ever heard that you had any say in this at all." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and underneath the exhaustion and the anger I saw the beginning of what might have been an apology, or might only have been the beginning of a very different kind of request. "I need you to say yes," he said, and for once there was fight left in his voice. "I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing, and I need it soon, because Harborline wants an answer by the end of next month." I looked at my son sitting at my kitchen table asking me, for the first time in his entire adult life, to actually decide something that mattered instead of simply assuming I already had. "I need to think," I told him. "And I need to see everything, Garrett. Every number, every page of that letter of intent, everything you haven't told me yet. Not because I don't trust you, because I'm the one who apparently has to sign it, and I have spent the last week discovering exactly how much I don't know about my own family's business." He nodded slowly, and for once he didn't argue. After he left, I stood in my kitchen a good while without moving, the soup gone cold and forgotten on the counter beside me. Part of me wanted, more than anything, to simply say yes, to make it easy for him, to spare him the humiliation of asking his own mother for permission at 45 years old. But another part of me, quieter and colder and growing stronger by the day, kept circling back to a single unanswered question sitting underneath everything he'd told me that night. He had explained the debt. He had explained Harbor Line. He had even finally explained the $31,000 in a way that almost made sense if I didn't look at it too closely. What he had not explained was why, 5 years ago, with his father already sick and dying in the next room some days, he had chosen to hide a mistake that size rather than simply telling either of us the truth. I did not yet know how much that particular silence was going to cost him. I only knew, standing alone in my kitchen that night, that I intended to find out. I called Alden the next morning and asked if I could come by his office, not his house, because somehow it felt like the kind of conversation that needed a desk between us. He said, "Of course, Miss Noreen, any time." The way he always did, though something in his voice told me he already suspected what I wanted to ask him. His office hadn't changed much since Vernon used to bring me along to sign papers decades ago. The same worn leather chairs, the same framed photograph of the harbor from before half the current buildings existed. I sat down across from him and told him everything Garrett had told me: the debt, Harbor Line, the vague explanation about a personal investment that had gone wrong 5 years ago. Alden listened without interrupting, the way he always had, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, turning his pen over in his fingers. "You already know part of it," he said finally. "I can see it on your face, but not all of it. Tell me the rest," I said. "Please, Alden. I think I've earned it by now." He set the pen down carefully. "Garrett wasn't entirely lying to you," he said. "But he wasn't telling you the whole truth either, which I suppose is a habit he learned somewhere. He explained, slowly the way he always explains things, that 5 years earlier, Garrett had personally guaranteed a large loan for a college friend's restaurant concept, a chain of upscale food trucks that friends swore was going to be the next big thing along the coast. When it collapsed within 18 months, Garrett found himself personally on the hook for close to $900,000. a sum he had no way of covering on his own salary. Rather than come to Vernon or to me, Alden said, Garrett used his position as an officer of the company to quietly redirect funds meant for the Providence location's lease renewal toward covering his personal guarantee instead. It wasn't outright theft, not in any way that would hold up as a crime, since he did technically have signing authority at the time. But it meant Providence couldn't make its payments, the landlord terminated the lease within weeks, and an entire location Vernon had built from nothing closed because of a decision Garrett made to protect himself rather than tell his own father the truth. I sat very still, trying to absorb it, and Vernon knew, I said, all along. Vernon found the discrepancy himself, going through the books of 2 months later, Alden said. He confronted Garrett privately, just the two of them, in this very office, as a matter of fact. Garrett broke down completely, admitted everything, begged him not to tell you, said he was already ashamed enough without you knowing, too. And Vernon agreed to that, I said, something hardening in my chest. Vernon forgave him, Alden said carefully. That's not quite the same thing. He loved that boy more than almost anything on this earth, and he understood shame and fear and the particular kind of desperation that makes a person do something foolish rather than admit weakness to the people who love them most. But forgiving Garrett didn't mean he trusted him completely after that, not with everything, not yet. That's when he came to me about the trust. He wanted the company protected, I said slowly, understanding now. He wanted you protected, Alden corrected gently, and Garrett protected from himself if it ever came to that again. He told me once, very near the end, that Garrett had a good heart and a real gift for the business side of things, but that good hearts, under enough pressure, sometimes make decisions they wouldn't otherwise make, and he didn't want the whole company, everything the two of you had built, to rest entirely on his son never being tested that way again. He wanted someone steady holding the line, someone who loved this family enough to slow things down when they needed slowing, without loving the business so much that judgment got clouded by it. That's why he chose me, I said. That's why he chose you, Alden agreed. Not because he didn't trust Garrett's love for this family, because he understood, better than either of us probably realized at the time, exactly how much pressure your son was capable of putting on himself, and what that pressure could make him do when nobody was watching closely enough. I sat in that office for a long time after that, looking at the harbor photograph on the wall, thinking about a husband who had loved both his son and his life's work enough to quietly build a safety net neither of us ever had to use until now. Not to punish anyone, Alden said, watching me think, his voice gentle. Vernon told me that more than once. It's so the restaurant outlives both of us, and everyone in it, including Garrett's worst year. I asked him what my options actually were, now that I finally understood the full shape of what I was holding. Alden walked me through it patiently. As sole trustee, I had the authority to approve or reject any sale of company assets, including Harborline's offer, without needing anyone else's consent. I also had the authority, if I chose to use it, to name a successor, someone who would eventually take over the trustee role and the governance rights that came with it, rather than simply letting that authority default to whoever happened to be running the company day to day when I was no longer able to hold it myself. I didn't decide anything that afternoon. I thanked Alden, told him I needed time, and drove home along the water with the windows down, trying to imagine what Vernon would have wanted me to actually do with the quiet power he'd left sitting in my hands for 5 years without my even knowing it was there. I told Garrett 2 weeks later, calmly and in person, that I would not be approving the sale to Harborline. I didn't tell him everything Alden had told me, not yet. I simply said that Harbor Street wasn't for sale, that we would find another way to handle the debt, and that I was prepared to personally guarantee whatever financing the company needed to restructure Portsmouth and Nashua without bringing in an outside buyer at all. He argued for almost an hour. Eventually, he left angry, and for the better part of a month after that, our conversation shrank down to short, careful phone calls about nothing at all. The kind you have with someone you love, but currently cannot quite look at directly. I filled the empty hours with the kitchen. I started teaching a Saturday morning cooking class at the Community Center 6. Students at a time, nothing fancy, just proper knife skills, and the kind of stock making Vernon and I had learned the hard way 40 years earlier. I found, to my own surprise, that I had missed it more than I'd let myself admit since the day I officially stepped back from running the kitchen at Harbor Street. Griffin came to me about a month into all of this, nervous in a way I hadn't seen from him since he was small, and told me he'd been developing an idea of his own, a tiny seasonal restaurant, 20 seats at most, built entirely around the original Daniel's recipe and a handful of dishes he'd been perfecting on his own time, something honest and small in a way none of the newer Doyle's locations had managed to stay. He'd been running informal pop-up dinners out of a borrowed kitchen on his nights off for months, he admitted, testing the idea before he had the nerve to say it out loud to anyone in the family. I asked to come to one. I sat in the back of that borrowed kitchen on a Tuesday night in October, watching my grandson plate food with the same unhurried care Vernon used to have, tasting a bowl of chowder that was unmistakably ours, and something settled in me that had been unsettled for months. I want to invest, I told him afterward properly, as a business partner, not a gift. He tried to argue, the way Griffin always tries to argue when he thinks he's asking for too much, and I told him the number I had in mind, the same amount, almost to the dollar, that I had once handed his parents for kitchen renovations they didn't need. I told him I wasn't doing it because he was my grandson. I was doing it because I had tasted what he was building, and because for the first time in a long while, I recognized exactly what Vernon and I used to be, sitting right there in front of me, in someone else's borrowed kitchen. We signed the paperwork in November. I became a legal partner in a small restaurant called the Little Harbor, set to open the following spring, and I asked Griffin plainly not to mention it to his parents until we were ready. I told myself it was because I wanted to protect him from Garrett's disappointment if the whole thing somehow fell apart before it began. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me also wanted to see how long it would take my son to notice I had quietly built an entire second life he knew nothing about, the same way he once built a second, hidden version of a company crisis I knew nothing about either. I sent Delaney and Silas a modest check that same month, enough for a lovely week on the Maine coast rather than 2 weeks touring Tuscany, along with a note telling them I hoped it was the first of many trips they'd take together, on their own terms, built by their own two hands. Delaney called me in tears, grateful in a way that had nothing performative in it at all, and told me for the first time about seeing that place card early and staying quiet. I told her I understood completely that grown-ups stay quiet about far worse things than a place card, and that what mattered now was simply that she'd told me. Colette softened toward me around the holidays in the particular way people soften when they've decided charm might succeed where directness failed. She invited me to lunch twice, asked pointed, careful questions about how I was doing, whether I'd reconsidered anything about Harbor Line, whether I might be more comfortable letting Garrett handle the larger financial decisions going forward, given everything on my plate these days. I answered every question honestly and gave her nothing she could use, and by February she had mostly stopped asking, replaced by a cool, careful politeness that felt, in its own way, more honest than the warmth had been. Garrett, for his part, spent those months restructuring what he could without Harborline's money, working longer hours than I had ever seen from him, cutting costs at the newer locations, personally taking a pay reduction he never once mentioned to me, something I only learned from Faye months later. I watched my son work harder and more honestly than he had in years, trying to fix on his own the very mess his own silence had once created, and some part of me, even through everything, was proud of him for it. By the time April arrived, the Little Harbor was 3 weeks from opening. My birthday was approaching, and I had made a decision I had been mulling over privately with Alden since January. In early March, I signed the amendment to Vernon's trust, naming Griffin as successor trustee, effective immediately for certain governance decisions and fully upon my own death or incapacity, giving him, starting that day, a formal seat and a binding vote on any future sale, merger, or major restructuring of Doyle's Chowder House. Garrett would keep every dollar of his ownership stake, every bit of his salary, his title, his day-to-day authority over operations. He would simply never again be the only person in the family capable of deciding the company's fate alone. I told no one except Alden and Griffin, who I swore to secrecy with the same seriousness Vernon had once sworn Alden. I told myself I would find the right moment to tell Garrett properly, calmly, without an audience. I did not get to choose that moment. It chose itself 4 months later at my own birthday party in front of 40 guests holding champagne when my son found out from someone else's mouth before he ever heard it from mine. My 66th birthday fell on a Saturday in July, warm and clear, and Griffin insisted on hosting it himself, a proper party at my own house, cocktails and appetizers, out on the patio while the weather held. Catered, of course, by Doyle's Chowder House, though he'd privately asked Fay to keep the invoice separate from the company books and paid for it himself, which I only found out much later. 40-some guests filled the house and yard by early evening, extended family, old friends, half the staff from Harbor Street, Tom and Ron Ramwell, even a few of my cooking class students who I'd genuinely grown fond of over the winter. Griffin had asked, weeks earlier, if he could say a few words before the cake, and I'd said, of course, thinking nothing of it, assuming it would be the ordinary sweet nonsense grandchildren say at these things. As the evening cooled, everyone drifted inside, and Griffin gathered the whole party into the dining room for the toast before cake, the same room where I had hosted 43 years of ordinary Tuesday dinners and every single one of Vernon's birthdays until the year he couldn't manage stairs anymore. He stood up with his glass, the last of the daylight fading through the windows behind him, and the room quieted the way rooms do when someone taps a glass. He thanked everyone for coming, made a small joke about how his grandmother refused to admit 66 was a real number, and then his voice softened into something more sincere. Some of you know I've been building a little project of my own this past year, he said. What most of you don't know is that I had a business partner from the very beginning, someone who tasted my food in a borrowed kitchen on a Tuesday night last October and believed in it before I fully believed in it myself. The little harbor has been open for 2 months now, and it would not exist without my grandmother, who is not just the reason I know how to cook, but is now, officially, my business partner. Grandma, he said, raising his glass toward me, thank you for betting on me. The room erupted in warm applause, genuine and easy, exactly the kind of moment Griffin had intended it to be. I smiled and raised my own glass, my eyes finding Delaney's, who was beaming, who I suspect had known for months and kept the secret beautifully. I found Garrett's eyes a half-second later, across the table, and everything in his face told me he had not known even slightly. He didn't say anything right away. He clapped along with everyone else, his smile stretched thin and careful, and I watched him excuse himself toward the sideboard where the drinks were set up and stand there for a long moment, very still, working something out behind his eyes. Colette found him there, said something quiet, and his jaw tightened the exact way it had in my kitchen back in the spring. He came to find me perhaps 20 minutes later, once most of the guests had drifted toward the kitchen for cake, catching me alone near the dining room window where I'd stepped back for a moment of quiet. His voice, when it came, was low at first, controlled in a way that somehow frightened me more than shouting would have. You've been funding Griffin's restaurant since October, he said, quietly, without telling me. I told him it was true, and that I had asked Griffin to keep it private for a while, and that the decision had nothing to do with hiding anything from him specifically, only with wanting to be certain the venture was solid before making it public. Solid, he repeated. You mean you wanted to see if my son's restaurant would succeed before you told me you were bankrolling my own competition 3 miles from Harbor Street? It isn't your competition, Garrett, I said. It's family. That's when his voice rose, loud enough that a few nearby guests turned, loud enough that I saw Alden across the room set down his plate and start moving toward us. You have no idea what you're doing, Garrett said, his voice cracking across the room now, loud enough for every one of the 40 guests still holding their champagne to go quiet. You're 66 years old, for God's sake, and you're about to hand my son a company, I spent my whole life building. I already did that, I told him, steady, though my heart was pounding harder than I let my face show. 4 months ago. You just weren't paying attention. The room went completely still. My own son looked at me like he had never once, in 45 years, actually seen my face. Say that again, he said. You heard me the first time, Garrett. He stared at me for a long moment, something breaking visibly behind his eyes, somewhere between fury and something closer to grief. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped low and hard. I've already spoken with an attorney, he said, about your competency, about whether someone your age making decisions like this secretly behind my back, giving away control of a company you didn't build, is actually fit to keep making decisions like this alone. A few gasps rippled through the closest guests. Colette appeared at his side, her hand on his arm, whispering something urgent that he shook off entirely. Alden reached us then, setting his own glass down on the sideboard with a deliberate calm that cut through the tension like cold water. That's a serious accusation to make in front of 40 witnesses, Garrett, he said, his tone even and unhurried. I'd think carefully before you make it a second time. This isn't your business, Alden, Garrett snapped. It's entirely my business, Alden said, still calm, still even. I drafted every document your mother has signed for the last 20 years, including the one you're apparently planning to challenge. I can tell you right now, as someone who has watched competency challenges fail in this state more times than I can count, that you will need independent medical evaluation, documented evidence of diminished capacity, and considerably more than your own wounded pride to get anywhere near a judge with this. Your mother has run a business, taught herself law well enough to ask me sharp questions for 40 years, and just privately negotiated a debt restructuring that saved this company without Harborline's help. That is not the profile of a woman a court is going to find incompetent, Garrett. I would know. I've spent my whole career around exactly that kind of case. Garrett's face had gone pale, some of the fury draining out of it and leaving something raw underneath. Then explain it to me, he said, his voice cracking now in an entirely different way. Explain why she gets to decide my son's future in my own company, without a single word to me first. I stepped closer to him, close enough to take his hand, which he let me do, though his fingers stayed rigid in mine. Because 5 years ago, I said gently, you made a decision that closed Providence, and you never told either of us the truth about it. And your father found out on his own and forgave you and loved you every single day after that, exactly as much as he had before. But he also understood something that took me much longer to understand myself, that loving someone completely and trusting them with everything, unconditionally, forever, are not always the same thing. He didn't do this to punish you, Garrett. Alden can tell you, he said those exact words to him. He did it so this restaurant would outlive both of us and outlive whatever hard year either of us might someday have. Garrett stood very still, staring at me, and I watched 5 years of carefully guarded shame finally catch up to him in front of half the people he knew. You knew, he said quietly, about Providence, about all of it this whole time. Only since the spring, I told him. Alden told me everything after you told me half of it in my kitchen. I have known for months, Garrett, and I chose not to use it against you, not once. Because your father chose the exact same thing 5 years before me, and because I still believe, underneath everything, that you are a good man who made one very bad, very human decision under enormous pressure. But I am also the person your father trusted to make sure one bad decision could never again cost this family everything. That is not a punishment. That is exactly what love looks like when it has to survive contact with real fear. He didn't answer me for a long moment. Around us, the room had gone almost entirely silent. 40 guests pretending, badly, not to be watching. Griffin appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, his earlier joy long since replaced by something stricken and uncertain, clearly working out that his own happy announcement had detonated something he hadn't seen coming. Garrett finally pulled his hand free of mine, not roughly, just slowly, and looked at Griffin across the room, and then at Delaney standing near him, and then back at me. I need to go, he said quietly, and walked toward the front door without saying goodbye to anyone, Colette hurrying after him, throwing me one unreadable look over her shoulder before she disappeared into the driveway. The party did not really recover that night, though people were kind about it, drifting home earlier than planned with careful hugs and quiet words of support. Alden stayed until almost everyone had gone, sitting with me at my own dining table long after the house behind us had gone dark and quiet. "He'll come around," Alden said eventually, "or he won't. Either way, Noreen, you did exactly what Vernon asked of you. Nobody could have asked you to do it more gently than you just did, in front of 40 people who never should have had to watch it happen that way." I sat there a long time after he left too, alone in my own dining room on the night of my 66th birthday, looking at the wreckage of a party that had started as something joyful and found underneath the exhaustion and the ache of watching my son walk away from me, something that felt unexpectedly like relief. Whatever came next, I was no longer the only one who knew the truth. And for the first time in 5 years, neither was Garrett. The little harbor celebrated its first anniversary on a bright Tuesday in May, and I found myself thinking back, the way I often do this time of year, to the October before it all began, tasting Griffin's chowder in a borrowed kitchen for the first time, and knowing without quite admitting it to myself yet that I was looking at something worth believing in. The restaurant itself sits 3 streets back from the harbor, 22 seats, a small chalkboard menu that changes with the season, and a chowder recipe that hasn't changed by a single ingredient since the year Vernon and I first wrote it down on the back of a receipt. The walls are covered in photographs now, too, not the polished professional shots from Harbor Street, but ordinary ones. Griffin as a boy on that same milk crate, Vernon laughing at something just out of frame, me somewhere in the background of nearly all of them, usually mid-task, usually not looking at the camera. Griffin found most of them in a box in my attic last spring and had them framed without asking. And I pretended when I first saw the wall that something had simply gotten into my eye. Griffin runs the kitchen himself most nights, still standing the way his grandfather taught him, weight balanced, never rushing the roux. On slow afternoons, he sometimes lets local kids stand on a stool at the pass and stir, the way Vernon once let him. And I try not make too much of how that particular circle closed itself without either of us planning it that way. Harbor Street is still ours too, still open, still serving the same chowder to summer tourists and old regulars who've been coming since before Garrett was born. We restructured the debt the way I promised Garrett we would, without Harbor Line, through a combination of a smaller regional lender and a good deal more patience than either of us knew we had. It was harder than the Harbor Line deal would have been, and slower, and I do not regret a single difficult month of it. Delaney stopped by the little harbor that afternoon with baby Grace on her hip, 7 months old now, with her father's dark hair and, I like to think, a little of her great-grandfather's stubborn chin. She has just started reaching for everything within arm's length with a stubborn determination that reminds me, more than I expected it to, of exactly how her own grandfather behaved as a baby, back before any of us knew what kind of man he'd grow into or what kind of trouble either of us would eventually have to survive. Her middle name is Vernon, chosen entirely by Delaney and Silas without my asking, and I have not managed to say that child's full name out loud yet without my throat tightening just slightly. Delaney has grown into someone remarkably steady this past year, quicker to speak up now, quicker to notice the small things nobody else in a room seems to be noticing. I like to think some of that came from watching her grandmother learn the same lesson a little later in life than I would have liked. Griffin's little restaurant has become something of a gathering place for the four of us in a way none of us quite expected. Delaney and Silas most Sunday evenings, me most Tuesdays. Griffin behind the stove where he belongs. We talk about ordinary things mostly, the baby, the weather, a new dish Griffin is testing, and it feels more often than not like exactly the kind of family dinner I used to imagine we already had before I learned we didn't. Garrett is doing well, from what I hear, which these days comes mostly secondhand, through Delaney or occasionally through Alden. He took a senior operations role with a hospitality group up in Portland about 8 months ago, work he's genuinely good at. Work that seems to suit him better, if I'm honest, than trying to run his father's legacy ever quite did. We are not estranged, not exactly. We spoke on the phone for almost 20 minutes after Grace was born, longer than we'd spoken in months. Mostly way we'll talk when neither one quite knows how to say the thing underneath the small talk. He called about Grace's christening to ask the date and couldn't make it in the end. Work obligations, he said, though I suspect distance had as much to do with it as scheduling. He sent a beautiful gift anyway, and a card with more written in it than I expected. 4 sentences that read almost like an apology, without quite using the word. I keep it in the same drawer where I still keep his father's handwriting. Some repairs happen slowly, if they happen at all, and I have decided I am willing to wait and see which kind this turns out to be, without needing it to happen on any particular schedule. Colette left her consulting work entirely last winter and started a small events company of her own, doing quite well from what Delaney tells me, no longer attached to the family name at all, by her own choice. I think in her own way, she needed the same thing I once needed, something that belonged entirely to her, built by her own hands rather than borrowed from someone else's legacy. I hope it gives her what she's looking for. I mean that more sincerely than I expected to, given everything. As for me, I still teach my Saturday cooking classes, 20 students now instead of 6, ranging from teenagers who show up because their parents made them to retired fishermen who never once cooked a meal for themselves until their wives passed, and everyone in between. I've spent most evenings this past winter writing down every recipe Vernon and I ever built together, the real versions, the ones with the mistakes we made along the way still included, meant for Delaney and Griffin and Grace someday, and for whichever of Garrett's children come along too, whenever that day arrives. Griffin asked me once, not long ago, whether I regretted any of it, the trust, the silence, the year of watching my own family come apart in order to put it back together differently. I told him the truth. I did not regret the decision. I only regretted that it had ever needed to be made at all. I am not the same woman who stood at a check-in table a little over a year ago, reading her own name reduced to a joke in careful calligraphy. I don't think I ever fully will be again, and most days now that feels less like a loss than it once did. People used to look at that place card and think they knew exactly what I was worth to this family. A number, a signature on a check. It took me a long time to understand that the people who truly love you never see you as something to manage. They see you. My husband spent 44 years building something so the people he loved would never have to worry. And somewhere along the way, some of us forgot that a legacy isn't only what you leave behind. It's what you protect while you're still here to protect it. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just grateful I learned exactly who was standing beside me before it stopped mattering. So if there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's simple. Never mistake someone's quiet for weakness. The quietest person in the room is sometimes the only one who was ever actually holding it together.